You are listening to the Patriot Pastors Podcast, where we talk about today's issues from a pastor's perspective, as well as calling America back to the faith of our fathers.
Without God, democracy will not and cannot long endure. If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we will be a nation going under.
Here's your host, Wade Lentz and Harold Smith.
All right, welcome to the Patriot Pastors Podcast. It has been, Harold, I believe since April, since we have recorded together.
I know.
It's been way too long. It's been a very busy summer.
I just
Vacations.
think I don't think you like me because all year long it was I'm in school, and then when school let out for the summer, you was too busy for me. I'm feeling kind of slighted. I just want the truth.
Well, I was out for 10 days for vacation, but I take a summer class. So really, I'm not really out at all during the year. So I'm not a bad student because I'm taking, summer school used to be, declared, okay, you're a failing. You got to take summer school to make it up. That's not me. I'm just taking summer classes so I can hurry up and graduate. And Harold, I have 4 classes left, and I graduate from seminary.
When you graduate, will you start preaching in a Martin Lloyd-Jones robe with a collar?
Start using words I don't even know what they mean. Yeah.
Man,
another thing, let me
ahead.
say this. Let me brag a little bit. Since mid-May, I have lost 35 pounds.
Son, that's like a 4-year-old that you've dropped.
35 pounds, and I am eating nothing but fat, meat, butter, bacon, all that.
I've lost 17 pounds as of this morning.
Oh, that's great.
So I'm 17 down, and I've only been doing it about 2 months, maybe.
Yeah.
And I just came back from vacation, and I pretty much stayed to my normal eating pattern, but I did have to eat at a few different people's homes. And I just don't want to be the guy that says, hey, I only eat 3 things. If you can't fix them, I'll just have a salad.
Yeah.
So I ate what they served me. And other than that, man, I ate pretty much meat. And I still eat a few green vegetables. I'll eat a salad, but my carb load every day is
no more Twinkies.
It's nominal. No sweets, nothing. And I never was a big sweet eater, but and I know you'll agree with this because you told me first. You're just sharper when there's no more carb lag in my day. I don't ever just run out of gas.
Right.
I walk a lot, and I don't get tired easy. I've just got a lot more energy, and I continue to lose, a couple pounds a week pretty consistently. And I'm not hungry. I don't feel like every other diet I've been on, I feel like I'm starving all the time. This is something I think I can sustain.
Yeah, it's really transformed my life. And I do eat some vegetables occasionally, like some low carb vegetables like broccoli or tomatoes. And of course, tomato season in Arkansas. Who can say no to that, right?
Right.
But nevertheless, I'm not eating the amount of carbs that I used to, which was a lot.
Yeah.
And tell a big difference.
Yeah.
Not only my physical weight loss, but my mental brain fog is not near as bad as it used to be. Yeah.
Didn't you say people noticed your preaching was a lot better?
Yes.
You actually had people tell you that they feel like you're preaching better now than they've ever heard you preach.
Right. Yes. They sure did. And
I know the seminary will try to take credit for that, but we're going to attribute it to to eating plenty of meat.
To eating right. For sure. Well, man, our topic today is going to be one that going to be discussing a preacher that you and I knew quite well. And I'm sure that many of our listeners know somewhat well.
Yeah.
Brother David Miller passed away at 78 years old, and he passed away back in August the 6th, and we felt like we needed to do a special episode just remembering his life and discussing the impact that he had as one country preacher. He impacted literally, you could say, the world, and he impacted greatly many Baptists, many people in the United States primarily. What a great jewel of a man. Hated to hear that he passed, but we know where he's at, and the Savior that he preached about for over 60 years, he has seen now face to face. His faith has become sight. And with that, we rejoice. So we just want to talk about the impact he had, and even maybe the impact that all preachers, godly preachers, have. Even though you may not have a seminary education, you may not be pastoring the largest church in a metropolitan area of the country, you still impact those to whom you preach, and you impact those to whom you are connected with.
Yeah.
So, Harold, tell me maybe your fondest memory of
Well, let
David
me tell
Miller.
you my first memory. We'll get on to my fondest ones later, but my first memory of David Miller was on a flyer. I was pastoring my first church in Mulberry, Arkansas, Vine Prairie Baptist Church. And I got the Sword of the Lord magazine every other week, whether I wanted it or not. And so that's what I read for religious material. My theological library took up about this much of one shelf on my bookshelf. And I got this flyer in the mail inviting me to a Bible conference in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, at First Baptist Muscle Shoals, the True Church Conference. And this was in its early days.
Mm-hmm.
And I read the whole premise, and I thought, no, this is something I would like. And I turned it over to see who the preachers were. At that time, I didn't know Jeff Noblet. He was the pastor. I didn't know John O. Sims. I had heard of Paul Washer, didn't know much about him, good or bad. And so I started reading about these guys. There were some other men on there, and I was reading about them. And I got down to David Miller, and country preacher at large. That was the title we always used. And I was like, that sounds like my kind of guy. And the next line was, he is a director of missions of the Little Red River Association. And I thought, I just rolled my eyes. I threw the flyer down on my desk, and I was like, any Bible conference that's going to preach a director of missions, I'm not
got to be boring.
Yeah, this is going to be boring, and he can't preach. That's why he's a director of missions.
Right.
You know, he can't pastor. That's why. And I just had this preconceived idea of director of mission. It was bad. And that was the reason I didn't go.
Mm-hmm.
So about maybe 6 months later, it would have to be about 6 months later, I was pastoring my second church, because that was the end of my first church. And I was now in my second church, and I got a flyer, and it said they were doing a small church ministers conference. And it had to be churches that ran under 100, and they were going to give you a motel room, and they were going to give you all your meals and books. And that was all it said.
Mm-hmm.
And it said you could bring other staff with you. So I called up the deacon and his wife, who was the secretary. I mean, they were pretty much the integral part of our church. I said, y'all want to go to this? Yeah, let's go to this. So we went to Bryan, Arkansas, to Geyer Springs Baptist Church. We checked into the motel they had for us. We showed up at the first session, and this guy comes out in a wheelchair, and he just drives through the crowd. There's probably 25 pastors in there and their wives, right? From all over Arkansas.
Yeah.
This guy turns his wheelchair around, kind of adjusts himself, sets up in it, says, my name's David Miller, and I'm a 5-point Calvinist. And I like to fell over. I thought, man, you just don't say that. I mean, that's
right.
You're going to get killed. They're going to crucify you. I mean, it's a wonder somebody didn't throw a hymnal at him.
Right.
And he started preaching on Rizpah on a rock out of the Old Testament, and crying out for the bodies of her. And I mean, it was phenomenal. And his scripture memorization, had no use of his hands to handle a Bible or notes,
Right.
everything. Just a phenomenal mind. And
Yes.
I really, that was my first introduction. And I went up to him and I said, "You're the reason I didn't go to muscle shows." Cause I was like, who would listen to a director of mission
Mm-hmm.
preach? And then I heard you preach, and he just laughed, and very good guy. I mean, you know him better than I do. I've known him for probably 15 years
Yeah.
and we know each other, but we weren't really, really close. You've known him much longer,
Right.
more
Yeah.
interaction.
We did not live that far apart. He lived in Heber Springs, Arkansas. I live in southern Faulkner County, which is about 45 minutes away. And the last 10 years that I've been here at Barrel Baptist Church, he's been here about 4 different occasions. And so, yeah, we knew each other uh, somewhat well. Um, my first interaction with David Miller is when he invited me to his expository's preaching school back in 1998. That's how
Yeah.
long ago that was. This was one of his first preaching schools, and I'll never forget the amount of time that he invested in pastors in teaching them the art or trying to teach them the art of expository preaching. And I'll never forget I was about 22 years old, and I didn't have any, college degree or anything of that nature. I had been to Baptist college, but I was a college dropout. So, but that's a different story. Um, but when we left there, he gave each pastor a trunk full of books, and
Mm-hmm.
I'll never forget how that made me feel. That somebody loved me enough and cared for my ministry enough to invest in about $500 worth of books
Yeah.
that I still have today.
Yeah.
That impacted me tremendously. Yes, the school was great, but knowing that somebody cared enough to invest in somebody that they really didn't know well just made a tremendous impact
Yeah.
that I never forgot. Um, I'll tell you a similar story. Back in 2009, I was at the Louisiana Baptist State Convention Pastors Conference, and I was filling in for a bass singer who was singing for this conference. And lo and behold, David Miller is there. And he, along with Al Moeller, Jeff Noblet is one of the key speakers. And much like what you said earlier, this is how David Miller started the service. He said, "I am a 5-point Calvinist. I am not a hyper Calvinist. You need to understand the difference." And you could have heard a pin drop, after that. But David Miller was a Calvinist in the SBC when Calvinism in the SBC was not cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
We need to take wasn't it Barbara Mandrell that sang "I was country when country wasn't cool"?
Yes. Uh-huh.
We need somebody to come up with a version of "I was Calvinist when Calvinist wasn't cool" for men
That would,
like David Miller and other guys
yes.
along that line.
Yes.
What I discovered from David Miller is if you're handicapped and in a wheelchair, you can get up and say the most offensive things that could ever be said in a church. And they're like, "Well, bless his sweetheart, just listen to him preach." I
That
can
is
get
the
up,
truth.
fit and healthy young man, say the exact same thing in the same tone, and they'd be like, "Fire that man," you know?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so David knew that. He and I even talked about that one time. I said, "You
Right.
can say a lot when you're stuck in a wheelchair that I can't say." And he grinned from ear to ear and he said, "I learned that long ago."
Sure.
And I think that's it's good to have men. And let's talk a little bit about David's upbringing. I mean, he grew up way out in the middle of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, um, he had muscular atrophy. That's what put him in the wheelchair, and that's ultimately it just turns all of his muscles hard. He can no longer use them.
Right.
I remember people talking about him preaching when he walked with hand crutches, and would just lock his legs out and lean up against the pulpit with his thumbs against the
Yes.
pulpit and just lean against it to preach. And matter of fact, story was told when he was in Lavaca, Arkansas, over here near me. Him and the pulpit fell down about 4 or 5 steps off the podium,
Oh my.
and he rode it like a sled all the way to the bottom and slid to the ground. And they had to, the communion table was upside down, flowers went everywhere. They got him back up in the pulpit. He smiled and picked up right where he left off.
My goodness.
But he grew up just preaching in small, simple, rural areas. I mean,
Right.
he often told the story about preaching. His first church was in Snowball, Arkansas. And I remember that. And I've been through Snowball, Arkansas a time or two. You got to be going there to get there. I mean,
Absolutely.
it is out in the middle of nowhere. And he said there were 5 old women there, and he would go and preach, and they would, they was glad to hear him. He said he drove a log truck there because he didn't have a car. So he had to drive the truck they worked with during the week to preach. And that kind of humble beginning never bothered him. And even later in his ministry, he would speak in big platforms like at G3 or the True Church Conference.
That's right.
But that's not what he did primarily. Primarily, he was in small local churches scattered across the country doing the same ministry.
Yes.
I've never known him to turn a church down for size.
No.
If you looked at his schedule of where he was preaching, he was oftentimes in little small congregations in the middle of nowhere.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And his belief in the sovereignty of God was something that really grounded his faith when he was diagnosed in the mid-'80s with this degenerative muscular condition that was slowly but surely going to take his mobility away from him. I mean, I can't imagine getting a diagnosis like that, but that did not deter him at all. His faith was grounded. He worked hard. He was not able to hold a Bible and read the scriptures like you and I. He was not able to use notes and turn pages like you and I. So he memorized. This is what amazes people when they first hear David Miller speak, is that when he was here the last time, he read one full chapter in 2 Samuel verbatim.
He didn't read it; he recited it from memory.
Yeah, excuse me. He recited it from memory
in the King's English, and didn't miss a vowel or
didn't
nothing.
miss a beat.
Yep.
And then commenced to preaching without notes. Well, that amazes people.
Yeah.
And this was said at his funeral. Dr. Herschel York said this. He said, "You never told David Miller, 'Oh, listen, David Miller, you have such a gift that I don't have to memorize.'" And he would cut you off really quick. "No, I do not have a gift.
Yeah.
I memorize just like the way you should memorize, through a lot of hard work."
Yeah.
And
that was one of the things that he pulled on us the first time I ever met him was at that small church ministry conference. And so he preached that night, and I was just in awe of his memory, his ability to preach, and the situation he was in. And then they had breakout sessions the next day, and his wife taught a session for pastors' wives. There were other people teaching. And one of the breakout sessions was expository preaching with David Miller. And I thought, well, dude, I'm going to go learn how to do that,
Yeah.
So I go into this Sunday school room that would probably seat 40 people, I'd guess. It's rows of chairs, kind of like a little miniature movie theater.
Mm-hmm.
And there's 2 other guys in there and me, and we're sitting kind of in a triangle, scattered out in this big room. David Miller drives his little wheelchair in, turns around. He says, "Where's everybody at?" And we kind of laughed. He said, "Men," he said, "I want y'all to come down front and sit right up here in front of me." He said, "I want to share a secret with you that I don't just do anywhere." He said, "You 3 men signed up to come here. Nobody else did. You're going to get something nobody else gets." And so we all 3 got up, and I mean, he had us sit right on the front row, elbow to elbow. He put us in these 3 seats, and he started whispering, getting real quiet. and he was all, didn't have a real powerful voice
Right.
anyways because of his disability, but he started whispering and he started inching that wheelchair up. And when he stopped, his wheelchair was hitting me in the toes. I mean, he was as close to me as he could get. Any closer, he'd have to have been behind me.
Right.
And these two guys were on either side of me. We're all sitting there. And he said, would you like to know my secret for memorizing so much scripture? And we all kind of, nodded our head like, yeah. Well, what's the secret, And he kind of played it up like, hey, I've developed this system, And then in as loud as he could possibly say, he said, there is no secret. He said, you got to work it out. You got to grind on it. You got to read it and read it and read it. And he went on for about 3 minutes, as loud as he could speak, as close to my face as he could get. And I got the biggest, I thought, he suckered all three of us right into this. And from that time on, I knew that I liked David Miller. I mean, I loved him as a preacher, but then I loved him as a person.
Sure.
And I would see him out and about at a meeting after that. And he knew I was from Arkansas and we had a lot in common. And he would all say, you still holding that conference? And I'd say, yeah. And he'd say, I'm coming one of these years. And I'd say, well, come on, you're always welcome. I'll check my schedule. Of course, I knew his schedule was booked to the top.
Right.
And, but yeah, he was just one of those guys that he had a great sense of humor. He had quick wit. You could talk to him and you would get, I don't know. He was the kind of guy that could say whatever he wanted to say without fear of repercussion. So he would be bold.
Oh, absolutely.
I've seen him tell men, things that, you and I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, but he could say it because of his condition. And plus he was so well respected, he just, but to start in such humble beginnings, Wade, and never try to, position himself, never seek the platform, just always wherever the Lord opened the door. And just being faithful with what he had and using the gifts he had. Just a tremendous testimony to his life.
Absolutely. What excuse do we have? Lord, I can't do this. Woe is me. And we have all of our facilities and all of our mobility. And, and then also he went through, not only through his own personal, difficulties physically, but when his son was 18 years old, he was in a horrible car accident that broke his neck, broke his spine, that left his son totally paralyzed from the neck down.
Yeah.
So now David is in a wheelchair and his son is also now forever in this life in a wheelchair. And that devastated David, as you can imagine.
Oh, rightly so.
But the Lord gave David the strength and grace, and Josh is a successful young man, Christian young man, who was for a good amount of time a state representative for Arkansas.
Yeah.
A conservative Christian state rep.
Right.
And but nevertheless, David went through those difficulties, but because of his grounding in God's sovereignty, he was able to flourish even in those difficulties.
He just had abilities that, and I don't want to pray. I mean, I don't want to praise his abilities as much as I want to say he used his abilities to the fullest. He didn't let the limitations he had hinder him. He had to travel with a personal assistant everywhere. He couldn't dress himself.
Right.
There was literally nothing he could do. Everything had to be done for him. But he would be in that bus, that big, like a tour bus. He would be reading and memorizing scripture. He knew that he couldn't do anything else. So he just continued to prepare his mind, prayed, preached. They're really just, he was just a model to everybody that knew him. And like you said, with that expositors conference that he put on to teach expository preaching, he did that free of charge every year. And I think that's why he and I kind of had a a little bit of a relationship because he knew I put on a free conference as well. And he would say, "How do you keep finding these men?" And I said, "Well, they don't grow in a cabbage patch, and they're not behind every tree." And he would laugh
Yeah.
about that, and he would always say, "Send them to my meeting."
Hmm.
He'd always send them to my meeting. That's what he'd always tell me to do.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they've never been, and surprisingly enough, a lot of them had been. I'll tell you a story. I didn't see this, but Richard Kleinard told me this story, and it cracked me up. Richard Kleinard's pastor for years was a man named Bob Weldon out
Hmm.
in southern Tennessee, and Bob Weldon was losing his eyesight. He eventually became completely and totally blind. But Bob Weldon and David Miller were really close friends.
Mm.
David Miller is in a wheelchair and has very limited use of his head, and maybe one or two fingers is about all he can move,
Right.
And they're having a fried catfish supper. And Bob Weldon is blind, and
No.
he's trying to give David Miller a taste of the catfish, and he's daubing it all over David Miller's face, trying to get it in his mouth. He can't see, and David Miller can't turn his head to get to wherever Bob's
Yeah.
putting the fish. And finally, David said, "Get somebody that can see to give me a big bite of the catfish." And I thought, man,
That's hilarious.
it is hilarious. But those two guys had been friends for years,
Yeah.
and he never let those disabilities interfere with anything.
Hmm.
He always had a great sense of humor about him. It was just a tremendous guy. I mean,
Yeah.
the moral of the story is none of us should let any situation we're in, whether we're preaching in Snowball, Arkansas, to 5 widow women, it's not the end of the world.
Right.
If that's where the Lord's put you, you be faithful there till
Hmm.
he puts you somewhere else or till that place changes. You know,
Yeah.
we should
Right.
all be striving to do our absolute best where we're at. And that's what he always.
Hmm. Yes. You mentioned earlier about David growing up uh, in the country in the backwoods of Arkansas. He loved hunting. He loved deer hunting. And
He'd
you
have
would
his
think,
assistant get the phone out and show you pictures of elk.
oh,
Hey,
absolutely.
show him that elk I shot. Show him that deer I shot.
Yeah, you would think that being in a wheelchair
Yeah.
and totally paralyzed would keep you from hunting, but that was not the case at all.
He had a
David,
4-wheel drive wheelchair, man.
yeah, yeah.
Crazy.
I asked him after he preached one Sunday morning. I said, "Okay, we have a lot of deer hunters in here, and they know you deer hunt and you take down these trophy bucks. Explain to them how you do that." And he had all those deer hunters' attention.
Mhm.
Of course, I don't remember how he shoots them. I forget how
He
they
has it
do it,
all
but
set up on it. It's like it's on a rest and it's pointed in this direction. And he's got his hand on the trigger and he's looking through the scope. Okay.
yeah,
He can kind of move his chair side to side. He has very little movement. So he pretty much, that deer has to pass. Usually he had a feeder or something out there where
right.
they're going to come here. But that would drive me nuts.
Oh
If I
yeah,
saw a
yeah,
giant buck to my left, I'd spin around and shoot it. If I saw
yeah,
one to my right, I'd spin around and shoot it. I'd stand up.
right,
No,
yeah,
the patience that he had to exhibit to hunt the way he did, and
yes,
elk was the same way. Elk, they cover miles a day. He would
hmm,
have to be set up on a trail knowing they would come through there. We'd have to stop them in his little limited window and
hmm,
shoot them. And
yeah,
but never hindered him a bit.
no, no,
He had a deer lease, I believe it was in Duck Hill, Mississippi, that he always talked about going to and
huh,
time there. And yeah, he was like I said, he was just a tremendous man. Of all the men I've known, he would be near the top of guys that
absolutely,
you would want to spend time with, value their opinion. And that was just every time I was around David Miller, that's the way I felt about it.
yeah, yeah. Let me tell you a humorous story about David Miller. The last time he was here in 2019, we were celebrating our 130th church anniversary. Our church was started in 1889, and he was there. He was the speaker for that homecoming, And after the service, I wanted to get a photo of everybody in the sanctuary. Okay. Everybody was in a hurry to get out. You know how Baptists are,
Mm-hmm.
especially when there is a meal
Yeah.
following,
You're
and
right.
that aroma of those rolls has already entered into the sanctuary. So I know people are antsy. So I ask everybody to stand up and don't leave yet. I want to get a photo. So as I tell everybody to stand up, I'm nervous and anxious, and I turn around to David Miller. I said, "Go ahead and stand up," not even knowing what I said, and my microphone is still on. And he looks at me like, and David had a way of his facial expressions were just,
Oh, that was all he
out of
had. He
this
couldn't
world.
animate any other
That's
way
right.
than his facial expression. They were great.
Yeah. And he looked at me like, "Are you kidding me?" So
Hilarious.
I was embarrassed. And then for months afterwards, those who heard me say to a man that's been in a wheelchair for 40 years to stand up,
And
yeah, they never gave me, or they gave me, continued a hard time for a long time after that.
oh man. Yeah, he was like I said, he was a jewel, and the Lord, there's strength and weakness, you know.
Hmm.
The Lord has never he's weakened every great tool he's ever had. He's crippled every great leader he's ever had. They've all
Hmm.
had their weaknesses, and you know, Paul, he learns that in 2 Corinthians 12. It's the weak things, you know, that God does the most with.
That's
And
right.
a lot of times God has to weaken us and get us to slow down and focus and say, this is what I'm called to do. This is where my focus needs to be.
Hmm.
And David Miller just used his weakness and let it be just a driving force to continue to study and prepare. And I mean, you know, you and I could throw a sermon together just quickly,
Yeah,
but the amount of just memorization he would have to go through just for the text he was going to preach from because he couldn't read it.
absolutely.
You know, he
Right.
couldn't write down notes. He had to have all that prepared in advance and deeply. And
Hmm.
man, it's just a wonderful testimony to the church and sorely missed. I mean, I pray
Yeah,
that the Lord would raise up someone else from the
right.
backwoods, some country
Right.
preacher at large, some unknown guy, uninfluenced, you know,
Yes.
by the agendas of the day that would just come and have a fresh approach. And that's the other thing. A lot of our preachers today, their sermons are just routine, they're cookie cutter, they're all the same.
Hmm.
With David Miller, it was a freshness you never knew, you know.
Absolutely.
So this sermon may be real exegetical. This one here may be bigger in application, and but they all were very rich and well thought out. And we need that kind of preaching more and more,
Yes.
if not more so now than ever.
Right. Right. You know, I have my biggest regret was when last year I contacted him and talked to him about speaking at our church, which would have been late in 2023. And he told me then, he said, "Brother Wade, my preaching days are over.
Mhm.
My lungs have so deteriorated. My diaphragm will not allow me to get enough breath. I should have known that his days were very short,
Mhm.
and me being 45 minutes away, I should have seen him
Yeah.
and visited with him. I would have loved that. He would have loved that." Um,
Tell the story, Wade. We've only got a couple minutes left before we're out of time. Tell the story about when you first had him come preach at Barrel and what he told you he was planning to preach on. You remember that? He called you the morning of and said he was driving down there.
what was it that he told me he was going to
I
preach on?
remember because I've laughed about it ever
Why
since.
I'm a 5 point
No,
Calvinist? No.
he said, Brother Wade, I think I shall take from my topic this morning the justice of God in sending unelect infants to hell.
Yes. Yes.
He was saying he was going to preach on God sending unelect infants to hell.
Yeah.
And Wade,
I didn't
you
know
told
what to
me,
say.
you were like, are you going to tell him no? I mean, he said, I don't know what to do. I just sat there, and he said, you said there was like 15 seconds of silence. And he said, Brother Wade, I'm only joking.
Oh my.
Yeah.
I forgot about that, man.
Oh, that's one of my favorite David Miller stories. And because you called me like right after service was over, and you were
Yeah.
like, man, it was great. It was great. And he goes, you know what that guy did to me? And you told me that. And I thought, yeah, that's the kind of stuff he'd pull. And he would come up
Wow.
with some stuff. But
Uh-uh-uh.
we got about a minute left. Wade, I think it's great that we just took a little time and talked about
Yeah.
how we've appreciated and grown and learned from and everybody. And you can find his sermons online.
Yeah.
If you can find a
Sermon audio.
video of them, yeah. If you can, or you can find interviews. I remember explicitly some interviews Todd Friel did with him at G3 a few years back.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with the ministry of David Miller, look him up, and
Yes.
you won't be disappointed. Brother Wade, you close it out. We got about a minute left, a little less.
Well, look, as Harold said earlier, we pray that the Lord would graciously raise up some more men like David Miller. And if you are, like Harold said, if you're not familiar with him, familiar yourself with him, and you'll be blessed. You'll be edified. If you're a pastor, you'll become a better pastor if you'll get to know the life and ministry of David Miller. God bless you, and thank you for joining us at the Patriot Pastors Podcast.